All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Emily Gallagher. I'm a program manager with Public Allies Connecticut, and we are excited that you're able to join us today for our third Lunch and Learn session. These are in celebration of Black History Month 2021. This year, AmeriCorps members from Public Allies Connecticut and Prevention Corps have teamed up to bring you a series of workshops that unpack and reflect on various aspects of Dr. Martin Luther King's philosophy. Today, we're excited to bring you Celebrating Dr. King's Legacy, the Philosophy of Triple Evils. This is presented by our public allies, Emily Ent, Brianna Williams, Kaylee Hill, and Alexandra Matamoros Infante, as well as Shannon Connery, and also by Prevention Corps members, Rachel Hara, Caitlin Comet, and Michelle Chaudhary. By the end of today's session, our goals are participants will be able to define each of the triple evils. Participants will understand how these triple evils intersect with one another. We hope that folks will engage in discussion about the triple evils and how we can work to dismantle them and make a more just society. And finally, we hope that you'll be able to identify how these triple evils negatively impact our society as a whole. So without further ado, I'm excited to turn it over to Brianna Williams, who's going to kick it off.
Hello, hello. So I'm about to say a lot of what Emily just said, but we would like to thank you all for joining us today. We want you to get comfortable, get your snacks, get your coffee. You can have your mics, not your mic's muted, but your Zoom cameras off or on, however you feel comfortable. This presentation will take up the better part of an hour, so we just really encourage you to get comfortable. In the Zoom space, we have a cohort of dedicated Public Allies Connecticut members, along with Prevention Corps CT members. Over the past couple of weeks, we have worked in tandem to help shine light on some of the topics Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. feared would continue to plague our nation. It is our hope that you will leave this presentation with a greater understanding of three of the most prominent threats to equality and the leading factors that have brought us all here today. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our presenters. Unfortunately, two of our group members could not be here today, so big ups to Caitlin and Rachel for their hard work, and I will pass it along to introduce my group members, starting with Emily.
Okay, hi guys. I'm going to just jump right in here. So what are the triple evils? In 1967, Dr. King gave a speech at the Hungry Club Forum, a place where white politicians could meet with Black leaders out of the public eye, and he kind of explained how these were all linked. Caitlin, who couldn't be here today, made this awesome artwork showing how they really are linked with one another and they intersect, and when you kind of dismantle one, they kind of all start to fall apart. So we wanted to start off with a little Padlet here, and I will throw the link in the chat. And we want to know, what do you already know about MLK's triple evils, and what do you think of when you hear poverty, racism, and militarism? So I will throw this in the chat. And you can just feel free to click the plus button, and everything should be anonymous. So feel free to share as freely as you wish. So I see injustice. That's huge. I think that's a good word that kind of encompasses all of that. And then They're linked to capitalism. He was working to address militarism and poverty towards the end of his life before he was assassinated. Always good to know. I think that they are all powerful and negative parts of life. Absolutely. Intentional and systemic. Ready to see him go? I feel that. I feel that. Okay, I'll do about another minute on this. So, okay, that's okay. That's why we're here. If you don't know anything about them, that's totally cool. We're all here to learn. Top-down prioritization on how to use, distribute resources that keeps Black and brown people disenfranchised. Okay, awesome. Thank you to everyone that contributed to that. That was awesome. And then we have this video that we just wanted to show about the triple evils.
On August 31st, 1967, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. delivered the Three Evils of Society speech at the National Conference on New Politics. The speech framed the problem that has been lurking within our body politic from its very beginning as the sickness of racism, excessive materialism, and militarism, and considered the three problems as the plague of Western civilization. Revisiting the speech is instructive for anyone who is troubled by current conditions, with the visible ravages of racism, poverty's inexorable march, and the ever-expanding military-industrial complex dividing the human family. The three evils that MLK spoke about in 1967 are the same ones that work today, fueling pervasive Islamophobia. MLK spoke of the United States' schizophrenic personality on the question of race. He described the two conflicting personalities as one that professes the great principles of democracy and the other that practices the antithesis of democracy. Every step forward has an equal step backward, which MLK identified as old prejudices, hostilities, and ambivalences that have always been there. White backlash was nothing more than good old white supremacy, never content with equality. Today, the Muslim question in the US is a manifestation of these crises. Elites use Islam as a counterpoint for their vision of what America ought to be. Today, any step forward is met with the same backlash that MLK so perceptively called out. In confronting materialism, MLK forthrightly described the internal conditions of the ghetto, where African Americans are locked up in perpetual misery. MLK spoke of the readiness of Congress to grant subsidies to the oil and cotton industries, but none to tenants and farmers. What they truly advocate is socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. The problem that MLK diagnosed has become even more acute. An Oxfam report shows that 62 individuals have more wealth than 3.5 billion people around the globe. The haves, heavily concentrated in the global north, are seeking to have more, and the have-nots, heavily concentrated in the global south, have nothing except their commodified selves, marketed as mere things to the highest bidder. MLK's words on militarism and war are haunting, blunt, and exact. This war has played havoc with the destiny of the entire world. It has torn up the Geneva Agreement. It has seriously impaired the United Nations. It has exacerbated the hatred between continents. and worse still, between races. It has frustrated our development at home, telling our own underprivileged citizens that we place insatiable military demands above their critical needs, and strengthen the military-industrial complex. This business of burning human beings with napalm, or filling our nation's homes with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into the veins of peoples normally humane, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. Today, war is business, for it directs billions of dollars of profits into the hands of the few by creating and supporting a death economy. Growth is fictitiously manufactured and connected to an ever-expanding death machine, while the powerless become the victims. The world today spends 1.4 trillion annually on military expenditures, while it takes somewhere between 22 billion to solve poverty. Racism makes it possible to overlook these short-sighted priorities. MLK concluded the speech by stating that the question we ought to ask ourselves is,
cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And on some positions, it is necessary for the moral individual to take a stand that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but he must do it because it is right.
the time is right to ask, are the current wars ravaging the world, the obscene open-ended militarism, racism, and Islamophobia reflective of the highest human values? If the answer is no, then why are we silent?
Okay, so that was just like a brief 5-minute explanation overview of sort of the things that we're going to be talking about today. So I'm going to turn it over to Alex to start us off with racism.
Thank you, Emily. Hi, everyone. My name is Alex. My partner was Caitlin, but unfortunately she cannot be here, but she did send an audio recording of herself speaking on racism. And so the quote that we have here is, racism is totally estrangement. It separates not only bodies, but minds and spirit. And so if you can change the slide, please. And I play that video. This is Caitlin talking on her piece on racism.
Hi everyone, my name is Caitlin Comet. I am an AmeriCorps Prevention Corps member and my host site is The Hub. I apologize for not being able to join all of you in real time, but please know that my heart is with you all and I really wish that I could be there. How do you define racism? Racism is not something that we are all just learning about now, but it can sometimes get tricky choosing one all-encompassing definition because we all have different views and experiences of racism. So what is your own definition? Also consider these questions as we go talking about racism to guide you to further reflect on this. These include, how does racism affect us? Who benefits from racism? And how do we challenge racism? Racism in our society. Like I mentioned, we all have different experiences with racism. Racism is pervasive. It fuels the experiences of individuals on all different levels and in all different aspects of life. Here you will see 4 levels of racism. These levels begin large on a macro scale in structural racism, and it is followed by smaller yet equally as impactful levels, including institutional or systemic racism, interpersonal racism, and personal racism. Structural racism includes public policies, practices, and norms that are perpetuated by racial inequity. Institutional or systemic racism is discriminatory treatment in policies and practices within organizations and institutions. Interpersonal racism includes expression of racism between individuals and groups of people. Personal racism includes beliefs, prejudice, and views that individuals have. Some examples that can be found on all of these levels include our government and laws. From the start of our society, only white men were allowed to create laws, govern laws, and vote. It's also important to acknowledge the Naturalization Act of 1790, which automatically granted citizenship to any free white people, or the Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation and disenfranchised Black people from any political or economic gain. In education, we see lack of funding in public schools, which informs many people of color, and lack of access and opportunities for students of color to achieve and finish degrees of higher education. In employment, there is significant wealth and pay disparities and high poverty rates for people of color. In housing, we see high rates of debt, high rates of homelessness, less opportunities to own a home, and we see many folks living in housing that is not being funded enough, therefore making it unsafe or uncomfortable to live in. We also see redlining and food deserts in these areas. In health, we see inequities in accessibility of healthcare and health insurance. There is lack of multicultural awareness in some healthcare professionals, and we see negligence in the care of Black and Brown individuals. We also see seriously high rates of misdiagnosis or overdiagnosis of physical diseases and serious mental health challenges in people of color. In our criminal justice system, there is racial profiling and high rates of policing and arrests of Black and Brown individuals. We see deaths of Black men, Black women, and Black trans women due to the violence and negligence of some law enforcement. There is policing of homelessness in some areas. These are all just a few examples. And in all of these levels, we have serious discrimination, violence, and hate that affects individuals in our everyday lives. There is lack of recognition and representation of people of color. And all of this has been happening since the start of our society. Racism essentially fuels the oppression of individuals in our society by denying power. And it calls for a fierce urgency in courage and action. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and racism. MLK constantly spoke to the effects of racism. He believed racism to be a sickness that will continue to lead to internal decay of our society. It is what gets in the way of connection and love with one another. It spreads hate and inequity and injustice. It tells us that there is one group of people that is more valued over others, that our country thrives on freedom, equality, and protection, but racism proves that there are constant exceptions to that promise. However, we are not hopeless. We are powerful together. MLK believes that each individual is capable of creating a just society. It only takes soul and commitment to ourselves, to each other, and to our country that can be even better than that promise. How do we undo racism? Racism cannot be changed. The past and trauma cannot be wiped clean, but we can change today and the future by recognizing racism, understanding the influence racism has on our society on all levels, challenge racism where you can, and seek justice. We want to be anti-racist. MLK consistently alludes to the power of the gathering of people, and that's exactly what you are all doing today in this beautiful space, what you're all doing this month. And we want to empower you to do so for every day that comes, to carry on the work that MLK has done and has envisioned for all of us.
Thank you. So the goal of this next topic is to help you understand what a microaggression is and begin to understand the multitude of ways that aggression appears. Implicit biases are attitudes or stereotypes that unconsciously affect our actions, decisions, and understanding. Implicit biases are often negative. They are pervasive. Everyone has them. They are changeable, but research shows that this process takes time, intention, and training. Implicit biases can impact our relationships, interactions with each other in many ways. And one way that implicit biases can manifest is a form of racial microaggressions. It can be intentional or unintentional, and sometimes even well-meaning messages communicated towards a marginalized person. And it's often by someone who may be well-intentioned but unaware of the impact of their words or actions have on the target. Microaggressions have two parts. One is the conscious communication, which was likely intended to be a surface compliment. And an example would be someone saying to someone, you're beautiful, you're really pretty for a dark-skinned girl. Like they're saying it as a compliment, but it's not being received as that. And the second form is the unconscious metacommunication, which is the message that microaggression sends. Next slide, please. And then there's other forms of it. There's micro assaults, conscious and intentional actions or slurs. Again, the examples are slurs, catcalling, intentionally misgendering or outing someone, micro insults, conveying rudeness and insensitivity and demeans a person's identity. An example that I put down was like, that's so gay. And the last form is micro invalidation, where an alien in your country, like someone foreign, unintentional misgendering, denial of individual racism, sexism, metrosexism, and so on. And so with microaggressions, we have different experiences and different things said to us. Next slide, please. And so what are some microaggressions that you have experienced or witnessed? I'm just going to verbally say some examples that I've written down. An example that I often hear is with my friends when someone says to them, but you're Asian, you should be good at math. They're implying that because like they're an Asian person, like they have to be good at math. The one I always get is when people ask me where I'm from and I tell them New Haven, Connecticut, and then they say, okay, but where are you really from? And I tell them I'm from New Haven, Connecticut. And then they're like, but like, where are you really from? Like, what country are you from? And obviously, like, because they see me like as a foreign person, they don't think I'm from here. Like, they think I'm from somewhere else. Like, yes, like my family is Mexican, but it like that microaggression is like, well, because they don't see me as like a white person, they think I'm from somewhere else. Another one is you don't act very Black at all. I heard this a lot in college, and it was really uncomfortable to hear, especially the person saying it to my friends, and other microaggressions that you may have heard or experienced and everything. And so to help combat these microaggressions, especially the unconscious ones, there are 3 strategies to use if you would like. The first is to make the invisible visible, where sometimes the person is unaware that they have engaged in demeaning or offensive comments. So you have to make it visible to them. The second is to educate them, focus on the impact as influenced by the significance, and to get the person to understand what happened and how it may have caused pain. And the last one is to disarm the microaggression directly by steering the conversation away from a problematic remark or joke to communicate that it's offensive. And next slide.
So this is a video on redlining, which we're going to skip for the sake of time. Okay, so now we kind of go into the section on poverty, and I do touch on redlining a little bit in my slides, so it's not going to be something that's going to be completely overlooked. So the definition that King has mentioned for poverty in a lot of his speeches, the well-off and secure have too often become indifferent and oblivious to the poverty and deprivation in their midst. So I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, who is going to talk about genuine equality.
Hi, everyone. So we know that MLK fought against inequity, and one of the parts of inequity is poverty. And so MLK recognized that the road to equality is something that's not over, that the battle now is about gaining that economic justice in America. So in one of his speeches, which was given on March 14, 1968, and it's called Other America. This is a great quote that came directly from his speech. And MLK talks about the struggle now is genuine equality, and it's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee a livable income and a good, solid job. It's much easier to guarantee the right to vote than it is to guarantee the right to live in sanitary, decent housing conditions. So this is genuine equality that MLK is talking about. He's letting his audience know that genuine equality is going to be this hard and long struggle because white America tends to be ambivalent about the equality for others. And he talks about economic justice. And so if we were to look at economic equality, the definition of it is that economic equality is a belief that people should receive the same rate of a pay for a job, regardless of their race, gender, or other characteristics that are not related to their ability to perform the task. And if we keep that definition of economic equality in our mind and we move on to the next slide, and so in this slide, I posted a few graphs, and these are great stats, where on the left, if you were to look at the graph, you see that the Black man earns at least 87 cents in comparison to the white man who earns about $1 on the dollar, and the Asian man that earns about $1.15. And so some people might say, okay, well, then get a higher education, then you'll be getting paid more. So then if you were to look at the graph on the right, where we look at the Black woman's wage equality by education, okay, no high school degree, the Black is earning about $21,047 in comparison to the white non-Hispanic men who is earning about $36,480. So, people might say, okay, well, go get the education. So if that Black woman goes out and she gets an education, so she gets her bachelor's degree, she's making about $46,694 with a bachelor's degree in comparison to the white non-Hispanic men who's earning about $75,080. If you were to look at those two numbers, compare 46,000 to 75, and that is a significant gap. That is right there, that that Black woman is earning way less in comparison to that white non-Hispanic man, despite the fact that their qualifications for that job and their characteristics for that job is the same. It's simply because the color of your skin tone is completely different. You're getting paid way less than what you should be getting paid. And so these graphs I put there because I think these graphs really capture the racial pay gap, because wealth is a great statistic that captures racial inequality in America. So if we, keep the economic equality definition in mind, and if you look at MLK and his, a speech about economic justice and gender equality, if we were able to achieve economic equality in America, that could significantly reduce poverty levels amongst racial groups in America and have a positive effect on just the American public in general. And then we can also accomplish that gender equality that MLK talks about.
Awesome. Thank you, Michelle. So now I am going to talk about environmental racism and how that kind of comes into play with impoverished communities and people of color. So natural disasters and communities of color. Communities and people of color are disproportionately impacted by natural disasters such as hurricanes, wildfires, earthquakes, etc. And the amount of relief aid given to help repair these communities. This picture on the slide is showing the devastating aftermath of Hurricane Florence in New Bern, North Carolina. Although this hurricane took place almost 3 years ago, communities of color still find themselves displaced and in disrepair with little relief aid given to them. Hurricane Katrina. We all know that Hurricane Katrina was completely devastating for the city of New Orleans in Louisiana, especially for the Black community. Neighborhoods of color were not only disproportionately affected, people of color making up 46% of the most damaged communities and neighborhoods, while communities with the least damage or little to no damage, people of color only made up 26% of those populations. The Black community also experienced unequitable amounts of relief, and estimated of $8,000 less than their white counterparts. This is an infographic that I thought was really awesome, explaining visually with awesome statistics and information about how environmental racism works and how it is negatively impacting communities of color. Race is the strongest factor linked to living near landfills, exposure to contaminated water, air, and soil. Individuals and families of color are twice as likely to live a fence line away from waste facilities and landfills than white individuals and families. They are also twice as likely to live without clean, drinkable, and usable water and basic sanitation than white people. Lead poisoning also impacts 11% of Black children compared to only 3% of white children. Unfortunately, 95% of these claims are denied by the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, making these issues that much harder to fix from a policy standpoint. And then we kind of go into just some facts, stats about poverty and military recruitment. 1 out of 5 men who served during the draft era reported at least one factor of childhood poverty, and 9% reported at least 3. Recruiters also deliberately exploit and take advantage of financial and social insecurities of low income and teenagers of color to enlist more soldiers. 57% of students at high school with JROTC programs qualify for free or reduced lunch. And just to give a more localized example, here in Connecticut, military recruiters made 10 times more visits to a largely low-income high school than they did to a nearby affluent school just a few miles up the road. So I'm going to turn it over to Bree to talk about the impacts of poverty.
Okay, hello, I am Bree. My pronouns are she, her, hers. So yeah, let's get into it. As we've learned today, poverty intersects with all of the 3 triple evils without racism. Well, not without racism, we don't have poverty, but most of the people who are impoverished in this country are people of color, and we're really going to get into that in my slides. But so some information on the impacts of poverty. Poverty is responsible for almost 150,000 deaths annually, which is the same number as the deaths attributed to lung cancer. And poverty is linked with a ton of negative conditions, such as substandard housing, homelessness, inadequate nutrition, and food insecurity. People living in poverty are more likely to receive inadequate medical care, and they also experience higher infant mortality rates. Next slide, please. And so some more stats about the impacts of poverty is that children living in poverty are more likely to have inadequate nutrition, which leads to health, behavioral, and cognitive issues. And we see that in the classrooms. So children living in poverty typically live in lower quality school districts. And this leads to higher high school dropout rate, leading to lower college acceptance rates, which then in turn restrict them and their own children to back into poverty. And this is called the cycle of poverty. In general, low income bracket, children that live in a low income bracket are more likely to be poor as adults and more likely to have become a teenage parent, and more likely to have employment problems as they get older. Next slide. So this graphic kind of shows just some of the ways that poverty impacts children. So normally in a typical school day, children might be worried about their parents because they may be unhappy, frustrated, or anxious at home. Sorry. So yeah, so children are normally worried because their parents are under a lot of stress, possibly working several jobs, maybe not getting to spend one-on-one quality time with their parents the way that some of their like counterparts, their peers do. So they may experience having fewer opportunities than children who are not impoverished. They may feel worthless, hopeless, and experience some social insecurity and anxiety. They may feel insecure because of having really large homes, like a lot of people in their home, and they may have no place to actually do homework or play. And I want to skip to the next slide, which is going to bring us into militarism. So our group partner, Rachel, is not able to be here today. So I will play an audio that she submitted to us. But this definition is from Martin Luther King himself. So a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. Just one moment.
To the section of this presentation regarding militarism. And militarism is the intersection of people and the US military complex. Next slide. So King lived and advocated during the Vietnam War. And according to government statistics, although only making up 11% of the population, 16% of African American men were drafted, and over 20% of combat soldiers were Black, which meant that on average, 1 out of 5 active duty soldiers were suffering from a opioid use disorder. And because of the sheer number of African American soldiers, a great portion of those soldiers were Black. And the Vietnam War also allowed for cheap, powerful, and high quality heroin into the United States in a way of sort of direct selling from the manufacturer. Next slide. MLK knew what was happening in Vietnam and firmly sided with the anti-war movements of that time. And African Americans were overrepresented in combat roles and were coming home battle-scarred both physically and mentally. It was very disenfranchising, especially since recruiters and the draft sort of advertised that the military would provide a way out of poverty. And in inner cities, such as Harlem, heroin brought over from Vietnam via smuggling routes from soldiers created one of America's first opioid crises. Next slide, please. Poverty and militarism go hand in hand. It was much harder for African Americans to avoid the draft or dodge the draft than any other ethnic group. A combination of poverty at home and not being informed properly about what was going to happen to them created a proportionately higher percentage of African American draftees. And they advertised that there would be financial compensation and that there may be a way out of poverty that was not previously accessible to them. Next slide, please. And Vietnam provided access to heroin in mass. Approximately 1 in 5 active duty soldiers in Vietnam were addicted to heroin because of the accessibility of heroin, and it provided an escape from the absolute brutality of the Vietnam War. And back in America, the drug dealer Frank Lucas, who was Black, took advantage of the heroin supply in Vietnam to flood Harlem with high purity, cheap heroin using military resources as mules. And Frank Lucas was active during MLK's lifetime, and MLK would have most likely known about what was happening in Harlem. So we have the poverty and the militarism and heroin intersecting all at once in Harlem during this period of time. So now we're going to fast forward to more modern day examples of how things have changed and transformed from what King would have seen to what we understand now as militarism and poverty and the opioid crisis. So the biggest things that have changed is that military weapons and technology are now accessible to the police at no cost to these departments, except for the upkeep and maintenance of these weapons. These were put through by programs 1033 and 1122 from the Department of Defense in the late 90s. This is when we saw the development of SWAT teams and police carrying semi-automatic weapons and great deal potential higher power than normally they would have had access to. As well as due to a lack of oversight, many weapons procured under these programs have gone missing. These programs are directly responsible for the militarization of police that we see and understand now. These programs didn't exist in King's time, although police brutality did exist. The biggest thing that has changed are these programs because of the accessibility of these weapons and these tools. Next slide. What has transformed in terms of the militarism aspect in the Black community is that predatory recruitment techniques used by the US military in low-income high schools became extremely commonplace. And although there are records of pushback, it has not stopped the recruitment process in schools. The talking points of military service are basically identical to what they were in Vietnam, that you're going to get paid and you get to travel and you have a way out of poverty that may have not been accessible or is seen as the only way out. These outcomes of the practices are destructive to the most vulnerable populations, including teenagers and young adults, because the techniques that they use are similar to grooming techniques seen in situations of physical, social, and mental abuse. Next slide, please. What hasn't changed is that we are currently in a very, very bad opioid crisis. That hasn't changed. It was caused not by heroin coming over from a war, it was caused by massive medical use of Oxycontin and fentanyl, which created a forced reliance on heroin when the pills or the fentanyl ran out. And now fentanyl is more common than heroin because it's purely synthetic. There's no natural component to it, therefore it can be cooked up in a lab with extreme potency. And although by the numbers, most people who are suffering are white, proportionately people of color have a higher rate of addiction per capita than white people. And thus, this crisis disproportionately affects people in communities of color related to their white counterparts. So we're very much back where we started. And although there are efforts to combat the opioid crisis, my program, Prevention Corps, being one of them, the fact that there is such a racial disparity of suffering that hasn't changed since King's time, wherein that Black and peoples of color suffer more than white people. So, next slide. So, In conclusion, the issues King faced haven't gone away. They've transformed and adapted to the changing times that have occurred. And there are new movements, such as Black Lives Matter, attempting to face these issues that haven't changed. However, these movements face the same issues that King did. And I am not someone who can say how to solve this crisis. I wouldn't even know how to even start changing things to de-escalate and to provide a sense of justice. However, I can highlight that these things have happened and things have changed, but they haven't gone away. Thank you for listening.
Awesome. Yeah, shout out to Rachel. That was really great. She couldn't be here with us today, but let's move on to the next slide and let's continue this conversation. Like, how does militarism show up still in Black and Brown communities, and how is it dangerous? Well, I have some slides here that talk about the school to prison pipeline. So the school to prison pipeline is a disturbing national trend wherein children are funneled out of public schools into juvenile and criminal justice systems. So cops in schools lead to students being criminalized for behavior that should be handled inside of the school. Students of color are especially vulnerable to push out trends and the discriminatory application of discipline. So white kids in districts over are doing the same things, but not getting arrested for it. And the zero tolerance discipline has resulted in Black students facing disproportionately harsher punishment than white students in public schools. Next slide. So Black students only make up 16% of public school enrollment, yet they account for 42% of all students with multiple suspensions. This is in a sharp contrast to white students who represent 51% of the public school enrollment, yet only constitute 31% of students who receive multiple suspensions. So Black students represent 31% of school-related arrests, even though they are only 16% of the population that are in the schools. And when we think about we think about the school to prison pipeline and how folks are going from, arriving late to class, arriving late to school every day, that resulting in detention, that resulting in low morale, that resulting in acting out, and that resulting in going to jail. Like, that's so massive and ridiculous. And in a lot of these school systems, like, it's not just the school to prison pipeline. School pretty much is a prison for a lot of them. They're coming in, they have to go through the metal detectors. They you know what I mean? Like, they can't leave the building. They can't do normal things like for other people. They feel very much trapped. And their students, not the students, but the teachers aren't much of a resource to a lot of the students in these neighborhoods. A lot of them are burnt out. Our teachers don't get paid enough. Sorry about that. Our teachers aren't getting paid enough to really be there and show up for students in the way that they would need to. And in a lot of these schools, they have a cop, but they don't have a school social worker or a school nurse. And these are just ways that really highlight the way that our society kind of tells Black and brown kids that they don't matter or that they are worthless. They can't even have school nurses, like their health is not important in school. Yeah, it's massive, and I don't know how we fix it, but I think we can start by getting rid of police in schools when we know that police cause like trauma to black bodies all of the time, to Black bodies, Black people. Yeah, it's it's wild. It's really wild. So let's go to the next slide. And these are just some infographics about the school to prison pipeline and the bullies in blue, which are the cops. So I'm going to skip over them. You can take a moment to look at them, and then we will move on to the next slide in the interest of time. Awesome. And I will pass it along to Shannon.
Yeah, I just wanted to close us out by saying one of the things we really wanted to talk about highlighting throughout this presentation is the intersectionality of the three pillars of the triple evils of society and how they kind of fall into the umbrella of capitalism. So I'm just going to read a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King. "We have deluded ourselves into believing the myth that capitalism grew in prosperity out of the Protestant ethic of hard work and sacrifice. The fact is that capitalism was built on the exploitation and suffering of Black slaves and continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both Black and white, both here and abroad." So thank you so much for everyone who was able to join us here today. And yeah, we appreciate your attendance. Thank you.
All right, I just want to say congratulations to our group. You guys did a wonderful job. In true Public Allies tradition, we'll take a couple comments if you have appreciations, anything that you want to share about today's presentation that you are grateful for, something you learned. In the chat, I see Yancey giving you some shout outs. Great job, team.
I know we're also running out of time, but if anyone else has any further questions, we'd be happy to answer those.
Awesome job from Cherish. Great presentation from Lisa Marie. Sounds like she learned a lot.
Not a question or just a comment. You guys did a really good job. It was extremely well put together. And so even though it was like a constant presentation, except for one activity, I still felt engaged the entire time. So very good job.
Thank you.
In the chat, we see from Shanae, appreciation for the information and statistics. Was there another comment?
No, I was just appreciating a couple of so many things about your presentation, but I thought like you really managed to do both like breadth and depth. Like the concepts aren't new, right? But like you went really deep on a few particular issues, and I found myself learning a lot throughout the whole time. And then just how inclusive you were to be able to include the voices of the members of your group who weren't able to be here today was really awesome too.
Excellent job. I want to say thanks again to folks for joining us for today's presentation. And don't forget to tune in tomorrow, same time, 12:30 Eastern, for our 4th Lunch and Learn session.
Bye.
Bye, folks.
Later, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.